Good afternoon, everyone. We want to welcome you to the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner's engagement session for Vancouver Island and Coastal Region. Welcome to all of you. There are a number of people on the call today. We've got about 135 people signed up. So you're not able to see each other, but we are all online. And I just wanted to let you know that we are recording the session so that it's available for other folks in the evening. We're so happy that you can join us today. My name is Sharon Thera, and I'm the Executive Director of Education and Engagement for the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. And I am coming to you today from the territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nations. So welcome to you, and I'm really glad you're here to join us today. And I'm going to ask Elder Alex Nelson from the Musqueam Zawadinak Nation to welcome us today.
Okay, I thank the Creator for this moment. I've acknowledged the Kwana Nations for where I'm speaking to you from. And in saying that, I acknowledge all the territories that we are all sitting from. My traditional name is Okwi Lakame from the Musqueam First Nations, and that's north of Vancouver Island Way. And I guess before I get into a prayer, I do want to say at the front end, human rights, human rights, human rights, human rights. And it just coincides with residential school, residential school, residential school. And I guess I've had the privilege of speaking in schools where there's very little written about residential schools. And so I come and speak to grade 4, grade 5s, and I witnessed a teacher and how she presented herself to the subject area. And she asked her young students, answer this question. When you were born and you came into this world, what rights do you think you deserved at that moment? And so the young students would put up their hands and they would start to provide answers, multiple answers. And I start to think about their answers. And this is where I say human rights, human rights. Everybody deserves the arms and expression of love and care to begin with. From whom? Their parents, their grandparents, their aunts and uncles, their community, the world. And then you get into other supporting elements and aspects of what right you have: education, language, housing, and all those wonderful necessities of life. And I just think about those young students in their innocent way of answering. And then I come to this moment. How innocent are we in where we're at right now? Well, I think that is probably our big question and our search. And so now I want to now get into a quick prayer. And in my language, I will thank the Creator once again for this moment. I'll thank the Creator for our families, our communities, our loved ones, and the world. I will ask the Creator to bless those that are in special need of prayer, those that may be grieving and have troubles, and that have all these troubles around the world. And thank the Creator for teaching us to believe that there's going to be a brighter day. And then I ask the Creator to be with us as we come and gather, give us strength, wisdom, and guidance as we deliver our gathering this afternoon. Okay, kila kesla wala skikamet kada nalakna. Sumakot julis kakot na maskakna panamayak kakot na kwakwistan. Yakila kesla kikamet kansasan. Lidlit no la hamasha. Sumakot julis utnikin. Ukoset. It's not numogus. So chagi kamakas ikakor na katalo na katsakwa nala. Ukosets. Beacon outcomes to that nala. Sumakot nik. Mr. Chagi kamat. Kaskakos. Open out. Nino kai. Jiba kuina jasper can on then what cola. Yaki like Tesla. I had. Thank you. Thank you, Shannon.
Haichka, Alex. Gila Kessler.
Gila Kessler.
Thank you so much to Elder Alex Nelson for welcoming us to the different territories that we are meeting from. It set us off in such a good way, and it made me relax right away. I was listening yesterday to Stephen Point speaking about what poverty is, and he spoke exactly the words that you spoke, which is that we are poor if our parents don't induct us into the ways of our people. And I appreciated that you mentioned that as well. So thank you. We have two groups that are co-hosting with us today, and I would really like to have the opportunity to introduce them to you. They'll speak a little bit about some of the functions within this webinar, and so I would like to introduce to you Ron Rice and ask him to say a few words about his organization and himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to Alec for getting us started in such a good way. It's so good to hear his voice. It's been a long time. I miss the elders very much here at the Friendship Center. The Victorinator Friendship, my name is Ron Rice. I'm from Cowichan Tribes here on Vancouver Island, and my hereditary name is Wooshk. I'm the Executive Director of the Victorinator Friendship Center, and have been involved with Friendship Centers since 1998. Took over this Friendship Center in 2.5 years ago. The Victorinator Friendship Center is about to celebrate, about to conclude its 51st year, or enter its 51st year. Last year, celebrating our 50th anniversary in providing support and service to the urban Indigenous community here in Victoria. Started out 51 years ago with one room and one employee, basically helping people who were looking for work and looking for places to live. If you can imagine, 51 years ago, there was some very racist practices as far as landlords and renting to Indigenous people. So they compiled a list of organizations that were happy to include Indigenous people as their tenants. The organization has grown over the generations. We now provide support and service. Last year we did just over 360,000 points of service in 10 departments through 53 contracts, providing everything from infant development and supported child development. We have an FASD program, an Aboriginal speech language pathologist program. We have one of the only lending libraries in a Friendship Center in the country, with just over 7,800 titles, and about 80% of that is Indigenous content. We have a medical clinic with two doctors that share a full-time spot and 2 nurse practitioners. We have a wellness clinic that provides acupuncture, chiropractic treatments, naturopathic medicine, nutritionists. We have a community kitchen. Last year we provided 63,400 meals and snacks throughout all of our programs and services. We have a community room, which in the wintertime doubles as our homeless shelter. We operate from November normally to the end of March. This year we had until the end of June, and provide shelter for 25 guests 7 nights a week through the winter. We have youth programming, and our youth program department actually mirrors the rest of the Friendship Center. So they have youth-specific drug and alcohol counseling, mental health, employment counseling, education counseling, as well as one-on-one support. We have a family services team, which works with families as an entire entity. And we have early childhood development, which works with mothers and children 0 to 6. We have a 90-space daycare right now operating in pandemic response, only serving 70 children in Tier 1 and Tier 2. And we have a career employment and education resource center, which helps people who are looking to further their academic station, as well as finding employment or improving their employment situation. We have 2 training programs around employment as well, which are cohort-based, and they'll train anywhere from 12 weeks to 20 weeks, depending on the program that they're in. We also have 51 units of housing, everything from bachelor suites to a 7-bedroom house. And we have some outreach programs like the Victoria Urban Reconciliation Dialogue, which works with a number of municipalities, different levels of government, First Nations and Indigenous organizations, as well as faith-based groups, neighborhood associations, some of the educational institutions, to talk about reconciliation in an urban context. So that's us in a nutshell. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Ron, for joining us and for co-hosting the session with us today. I think I know where I'm going to come when I'm in Victoria to get a meal. In addition to the Victoria Friendship Center, we have the Victoria Disability Resource Center co-hosting our session, and I'd like to welcome Kathy Elford to say a few words.
Thanks so much, Sharon. I'm a relatively new board member with the Victoria Disability Resource Center, just only a few months on board, so I'll keep my remarks pretty brief. I appreciate Ron's very thorough introduction of the Native Friendship Center. We are a nonprofit agency. We are a member of Independent Living Canada. We primarily work with individuals with disabilities and community organizations to find and remove barriers that prevent folks' full participation in whatever they choose to do in their lives. We have a small staff team. We rely on the generosity of volunteers to provide a lot of these programs. Our primary programs are information and referral, peer support programs, skill development, employment, and research and development. And at the moment, obviously, with COVID-19, we are offering the bulk of these services remotely and virtually, which it's been quite successful. So I'm proud to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to co-host. I think I was also asked to, in light of our mandate for accessibility, to just provide some notes to all the participants on how the webinar is being offered and what kind of access there is. The first note is that all the written information will be read out loud, so no one will miss anything on the slides. Secondly, we've tried to make the visual materials accessible as well. But if there's we would appreciate any feedback from the participants that will help us do this better next time. And thirdly, if participants have used their phone to call in to the meeting today and want to raise your hand, we just remind you to press number sign 9 on your phone, or asterisk sign on your phone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. In addition, we have Laura Track from the BC Human Rights Clinic, which is located in the Community Legal Assistance Society. And Laura, would you mind saying a few words? Later, Laura will offer a little bit of information about the legal clinic.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. Thank you very much to the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner for inviting me to participate in today's session. I'm joining you today from the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and really happy to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the BC Human Rights Clinic and what we do and how we may be able to assist you.
Thanks so much for joining us, Laura. And we have staff from the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. We've got Margot and Emily, and I'll ask them to give an introduction as well.
Hello, my name is Margot D'Arcangelo, and I'm Manager of Education with the office, and I'm calling from home on Lekwungen territory. And this weekend, I have a tiny human who's visiting for the first time and going to see the ocean for the first time. And thinking of that just makes my heart swell and makes me have deep feelings of gratitude for this place and the stories on these lands and the people who have and the relationships that have nurtured and protected these unceded lands and territories that I call home. And I can see quite a few familiar names on the call list, which is wonderful. I've had the good fortune to work and learn from quite a few of those folks, and also a lot of new names too. So looking forward to sharing this space and to the conversation that we're having today. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily. I'm the Research and Engagement Coordinator with the Commission. I am calling from the unceded and traditional territories from the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, now known as Vancouver. I also wanted to add on a couple notes about the webinar function, just because I know many of you might be used to the Zoom meeting functions, but we're calling in through webinar today, and so some of the settings might be a little bit different to what you're used to. So I just wanted to let you know that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So while the presentation and conversations are going on, feel free to add your questions into there, and we will help you ask those questions to the Commissioner. We have the chat function available for now as well if you have any tech-related concerns that we can help you with. And then we're going to close down the chat so that all the communication is going through the Q&A after that. I think the only other thing I want to say is that we're lucky to have a captioner with us today. You might see them on your panel as CC provider. If you would like to add captions to your call, you need to click the closed caption button at the bottom. There's a little up arrow beside closed caption. So you click that and then click show subtitle, and then you should be able to see the captions there. And please let us know if that is accessible to you, or if you need any help, you can throw that into the chat and we will help you there. And yeah, thanks so much for being here. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, everyone. And then finally, anchoring our team, of course, is the Commissioner, and I'll do a more fulsome introduction later, but I'll just give her a chance to wave at you and say hello.
Hello, everyone. Alex, thank you so much for starting us off in such a powerful way. And thank you to Kathy and Ron for co-hosting. And Laura, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you later. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, I'll spend some time just walking you quickly through the agenda and what we have planned for the rest of the afternoon. And then after that, we will begin our session in a more fulsome way. In addition, I wanted to share with you that there are a number of organizations that have joined us. And we've put a slide up so that you can see who's on the call with you and with all of us. I don't want to read everybody's names out, but we thought we would just put that up for you to have a look at who is on the call with us today. So exciting. Welcome, everybody. So grateful that you took the time to spend with us this afternoon. In terms of the way that the call will go for the rest of the afternoon, we are going to spend time now looking at your reasons for joining a session like this one. You know, what it is that drew your attention and caused you to think about maybe coming to join our session today. I gesture a lot, and it's really difficult in a Zoom call when you're sitting to not be able to move around. So you might see me shifting around and making little funny head tweaks. So just don't pay any attention to me or just shut me off. After that, we will have a presentation from the commissioner, and we'll have a chance to hear some questions that will arise out of that. After that, we'll have a break in between the commissioner's presentation. We'll look at a little video that we prepared, and then we want to hear from you. One of the major reasons that we're doing this process is because we want to hear about human rights issues that are relevant in your region. We've had the opportunity to spend some time in other regions in the province, and the feedback that we're getting has been invaluable in helping us understand what the human rights landscape is in the rest of the province. And not surprisingly, each region has its own issues, and so we want to hear from you. What's relevant and what's present in your region in this particular moment in time. And then after that, we have a little evaluation for you to tell us how we can improve the session, and we hope to have a little closing with you. So from there, we'll move into our, we have a little exercise around what it is that drew you to this session. So at the moment, I think we've logged into our Human Rights Code, which we probably should be looking at our Mentimeter at this moment in time.
Hi everyone, so I'm going to post a link here into the chat. You should be able to access it there, and that will bring you up to Mentimeter. So this is a new thing we're trying out for this meeting. So in Mentimeter, you will see a question, which is what brings you to this conversation today? And if you could just type in some words that brings you to the conversation today, we will show you the results as they come in, and we can read out the results as well for folks who might be calling in by a phone.
So while we're doing that, we had a request to post the list of organizations again. So, oh, no, we are right into our Mentimeter. So these are the reasons that people have joined the session today.
So I'm going to read out some of the larger words as they come in here. And I'll try to read quickly because they're zooming around. We have disability, information, learning, curiosity, concern.
Accessibility.
We have collaboration, curiosity, volunteer, human rights, gain knowledge, insights.
Race issues, education.
Disability justice is in there now, past experiences. This is great, everyone. Thank you so much. So for those of you that can see the Mentimeter, the larger words are the ones that more people are mentioning. So right now it's disability, education, accessibility, learning are some of the larger ones there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Okay, so someone is looking for a code. Do we need a code to access Mentimeter, or can you just enter it?
Oh, looks like it's working okay now. Great.
Okay. Thank you all for sharing your reasons for joining us today. It helps us to understand how we can create learning opportunities and sharing opportunities that are relevant for you. So we appreciate that you spent the time to do that. Right now, we're going to move on to hear from BC's Human Rights Commissioner, and I'd like to just spend a few minutes introducing her to you. So our new commissioner is Kasari Govinder, who took office in September of 2019. Her role is to lead the promotion and protection of human rights in British Columbia through the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. Ms. Govinder has spent her life promoting human rights, and her focus has been on the rights of those who are most marginalized and vulnerable. She's passionate, and I can tell you this from firsthand knowledge. Kasari's one of the most passionate people about human rights that I've met in my lifetime. And she's passionate about using her skills as a lawyer and community builder to create a more equal and just BC. She's worked closely with many organizations and communities in promoting gender equality, Indigenous rights, children's rights, the rights of people with disabilities, and the rights of migrant communities. Kasari spent some time as the executive director at West Coast Leaf. Many of you might be familiar with that organization. She co-authored a number of key reports and articles, and she speaks widely today on issues such as violence against women, access to justice, balancing human rights, and regulating hate speech. Earlier work includes pivotal roles in establishing the Rise Women's Legal Center, which is a nonprofit legal clinic in British Columbia. She went to law school at the University of Victoria, and then went on to do a master's degree in international human rights law at the University of Oxford in the UK. She was a member of the board of the University of Victoria, Pivot Legal Society, the Coalition for Public Legal Services, and the Society for Children and Youth. She has taught as an adjunct professor of law at the University of British Columbia and as an instructor at SFU University. In 2019, her work was recognized by the Women Lawyers Forum with their Award for Excellence. In addition to her role as the Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari is a mother, an aunt, a daughter, and a sister. And so I want to welcome Kasari to the session today.
Thank you, Sharon. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I think I saw Rise Women's Legal Center on the list of attendees, if I'm not mistaken. And that Laura Track, who joins us today from class, was also instrumental in developing that clinic, and we worked closely together at that time. And so it's such a pleasure to be working again together in this new way. So hello to all of you, and thank you so much again for joining us today. It's such an unusual time, and I'm so glad we found ways to continue to connect and have these important conversations, which, as we all know, it's always an important time to be talking about human rights, but never so much as when they are more threatened, which I think in this great time of stress and really crisis, they matter more than ever. And so it's, I think it's in times like these that for us to join together in learning exercises and also in the exchange of ideas, and for us really to learn from you and from community about what we should be working on and what your priorities are and experiences are, and the experiences of the folks you work with is so incredibly important. So today I want to share a bit of information about human rights protections and responsibilities that we share. I want to hopefully spark a conversation about what they mean for you in your life and your work. So first, I'm going to talk about the different layers of human rights protections. Many people are familiar with the UN and with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but we don't always know how the different layers of rights work or how we can use them to protect our rights or the rights of others. So I want to talk a bit about the different protections that exist at the international, constitutional, and statutory levels. Then Sharon's going to share some specific information about the Human Rights Code and how that works. And finally, I'll share a bit about our office, the watchdog function that we play, and how you can take part in the work to protect human rights in BC and sort of contribute to that work. I shouldn't say take part, because of course, many of you, maybe all of you, are already working hard to do that work in your own lives. We're not planning for too long, so I'm hoping there'll be lots of time for discussion and questions when I'm done. Sharon, I know you have recognized the homelands that many of you have found yourselves on. And Alex, as I said, has started us off in this powerful recognition of the land and the territory that we are virtually visiting today. But I am here in Vancouver on the unceded and traditional homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And in the tradition of some of BC's First Nations, territorial acknowledgement, of course, is more than just recognizing the territory that we are on. It's also an introduction of who is here in this place and why they are here. So in that spirit, I want to introduce myself in relation to these territories and to the work I do on them. I come to this place from a family shaped by the forces of systemic racism in the form of apartheid South Africa and its impacts on the Indian community in that country. I also come to this place from a long line of social justice activists, including a mother who spent her career working to address violence against women and children. So it's out of this context, it's out of those dinner table conversations about feminism and race and free speech and all those good things that I've spent the last decade working as part of the gender equality movement, using law as a tool for social change. And in fact, I lived on the island to go to law school. I went to UVic. And that I now work as BC's Human Rights Commissioner, primarily from what is now known as Vancouver. I offer this introduction as a means of placing myself in the context of these lands and this work, and as a means of saying thank you to the Coast Salish peoples who have cared for these lands for generations. So turning then to the slide in front of you, what are human rights in the first place? Why are we here? What are we talking about? There are so many different ways to answer that question. Human rights is an idea. It is the idea that we are all born entitled to fundamental rights just for being people. Human rights is also an approach. Human rights can be understood as a framework that can guide us in creating laws and policies that seek to empower people impacted by human rights issues, to involve them in the development of laws and policies regulating their lives, and to hold governments accountable for their actions. Also, human rights is a very concrete set of rights, of entitlements that are enforceable in different ways under different systems of law. So that's where I want to turn to next. For you as a person living in British Columbia, there are basically 3 levels of human rights protections that exist: international, constitutional, and statutory. And I'm going to break those down a little bit. So these all work in different ways. Margot, if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So international human rights govern the relationship between governments and individuals, not individuals to each other. This means that a country like Canada has obligations to the international community to make sure that we are living up to the various treaties and international instruments that we've signed onto. This includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which outlines 30 rights that countries around the world have agreed to for their citizens, to guarantee to people simply because they are people. They include the right to live free from torture, the right to live free from slavery, the right to own property, to equality and dignity, to be free from all forms of discrimination. The international human rights layer also includes a pretty complex web of rights as outlined in various treaties and international instruments, such as the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which talks about things like freedom of speech or the press. There's really a lot going on at the international level, and that level of human rights is binding, but not enforceable. So in some ways it represents an aspirational set of standards. This means that you can hold Canada accountable for failing to live up to these obligations by going to various human rights bodies that enforce them, but you can't generally go to a Canadian court and ask them to deliver a decision that binds the government to take specific actions. There's a couple of exceptions to this, but that's the general gist of international law. So next slide, please. I'm going to turn then to constitutional law. So constitutional law, like international, governs state relationships to individuals, rather than, again, individuals to individuals. It is binding on government and government agents only. So it doesn't bind individual actors like stores or organizations. And that's, I think, something that's not well broadly understood, is that the Constitution really has that kind of narrow application. But one of the things that's really powerful here is that this form of human rights protection is enforceable through Canadian courts. So you can bring a constitutional challenge to say, hey, look, government, you're not respecting my rights, and courts need to help me resolve this problem and perhaps get me a resolution to the problem. Constitutional rights are really focused on civil and political rights, which again is sort of focused on things like freedom of speech, equality is in there, right to life, liberty, and security of the person. This area does not cover issues like poverty, for example. So it's a more narrow set of rights. You can have the next slide, please. So finally, I want to talk a bit about statutory human rights law. This is the example here in BC is the BC Human Rights Code. And that, skipping ahead for a moment, that's the piece of law that creates the Human Rights Commission. But it also does a bunch of other very important things. And it governs private relationships. So unlike the other two areas that I've spoken about, it regulates the relationship between individuals or between organizations, as opposed to only applying to the way that government treats us. There are separate federal and provincial laws here. So there's the Canadian Human Rights Act and the BC Human Rights Code. I'll leave aside the complexity of that right now. The one that has the most impact in your daily life is usually our daily life, I should say, is the BC Human Rights Code. These rights are also enforceable, but not through courts, through the Human Rights Tribunal, and which is an important organization that I will talk a little bit more about a bit later on. But it's a bit like a court, but with some key differences. And these laws deal only with discrimination rather than the broader range, the very broad range under international law, which is the full gamut of human rights, everything you can think of on human rights, to constitutional law, which is only civil and political, only these rights about freedom to be from the government interfering in your rights. And the Human Rights Code is really focused on discrimination. So Sharon, I'd like to just pass it over to you to talk about some of the details of the Human Rights Code and what it means to all of us, and then I'll continue on with the role of the Commission.
But I am muted. So I've just unmuted myself. We've got a quick poll to share with you right now, just to get a sense of whether you have any familiarity with the Human Rights Code or not. So we're going to launch that and give you a few minutes to participate in the poll. Okay, so we're getting some responses in now. And the first question asks, which of the following is not a protected ground in BC? And the responses are race, religion, weight, gender identity, disability, poverty. And the second question asks, which of the following areas are protected under the code? Housing, services, publications, online publications, and employment. So we'll just give that a minute or two to run. All right. Margot, can you just close it off and we'll share the results? So for the first one, the response, the answer to the question, which of the following is not a protected ground in BC? And most people answered weight. And that is correct. That is, size is actually an issue that is not covered under the Human Rights Code. So, hey, you all know what you're talking about. In addition, we have poverty included in that list, and it may be surprising to you, but poverty also is not covered and is not a protected ground under the BC Human Rights Code. It is in other provinces, and it's an issue that the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner has made a priority. So I'm sure the Commissioner will talk about that a little bit more later on. And then the second question, which of the following areas are protected under the code? We had housing, services, publications, online publications, and employment. And the overwhelming response there was employment is an area that's not protected under the code, but that is actually not the case. Employment is covered. One of the things that's not covered under the code is online publication, so anything that's produced digitally. That might be interesting for you to know. So thank you all for responding to that, and I wanted to ask Margaret to advance to the next slide. So these are actually the grounds that are covered under the 4 areas in the BC Human Rights Code. People talk about the 4 corners of the code. I found that lawyers use that language, the 4 corners of the legislation. And it's interesting that we were able to put it together in 4 corners. So under the issues of the areas of employment, housing, services, and publications, and that's written publications, all of these grounds are covered. So you can't be discriminated on based on your age or your family status or based on gender expression and identity or mental disability or physical disability, ancestry, color, place of origin, race, sex, sexual orientation, source of income, political belief, religion. And just a note to remind you that because of our accessibility policies, we'll be reading everything on all of our slides. So these are the grounds that are covered under the code, and those are the areas that the code represents. In addition, I wanted to share with you on the next slide that not all of the grounds are covered under the code, under each area of the code. So for instance, age is protected in employment, in housing and tenancy, and in services, but not in purchasing property. Or source of income is protected under housing and tenancy, but not under the other 3. And as we do these regional gatherings, we'll be presenting more information on the BC Human Rights Code. We'll bring workshops to your region. So this is just a little quick introduction to some of the things that are covered in the code. We wanted to bring to you a sense of what's available in the province right now. So as we've gone through the regional gatherings, we've had people asking us for more information, and for sure we'll be doing more in-depth training on the code as we go along. This is just a little teaser that we wanted to bring to you today. I wanted to mention that there are some defenses that are available to some of the discriminations that may be offered, and those would be cases where it might be difficult for a service provider to accommodate someone who's protected under one of the grounds. So while these are areas that we're protected against, there are some defenses that providers might be able to provide. So with that, I will pass it back over to Kasari. But I know that, Kasari, that we had a couple of questions based on the last part of your talk. And so I wanted to ask Kathy if she could bring her question forward.
Sure. I'm just asking on behalf of some of the participants, how do you make a complaint about an international human right?
So there are a number of international bodies that accept complaints. Canada hasn't signed on, so there's there's a series of conventions, and they protect different areas. So there's a convention on the rights of people with disabilities. I think there's already been a comment about that. There's a convention on the rights of the child, and so on. So some of those are separated by population of people. Some of them are separated by the kind of right. So they apply across the board, but they're about the type of right. Some of them are focused on women, focused on Indigenous people, focused on children. I'm having the same problem as Sharon. I'm waving my hands around. I'll try to keep them to myself. So under some of those regimes, you are able to file an individual complaint, and each country can decide whether to sign on to that additional piece of that convention. So for example, Canada has signed on to the optional protocol for the International Bill of Rights on Women. It's called CEDAW for short. And so there's a committee, an international committee that oversees that the implementation of that convention, and they can accept complaints. Even if you get a positive decision, though, it's sometimes hard to get that enforced because there's not a lot of integration between the international system and the Canadian system. So you don't have somewhere to go to say you have to enforce this. It's largely a kind of shame-based system. So you can go to the media and say, look, the UN is saying, the international community is saying this is wrong. The Canadian government or the BC government has an obligation under law to fulfill this. And it's largely through that kind of mechanism that you can get results in the end.
Okay, thanks, Kasari. Ron, did you have a question as well? Not hearing from Ron. Maybe he's muted.
I am muted, sorry.
Oh, that's okay, go ahead.
The question that I have here is, what is a constitutional challenge?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. It is a court case that you can, it's like suing the government. So you can go through the process. Usually you'd hire a lawyer to do that because they are quite complex, and bring a challenge to the court. So you could bring a court case and to say the government has violated my rights under this section of the charter, and this is what I'd like to see happen from it. There's lots of pros and cons to going in that way. Certainly the huge con, the huge disadvantage is it's quite an onerous process. So it's hard. It's hard and time consuming, and it can be expensive, quite expensive. The really amazing thing about going through that process is that you have more possibility, you have possibility for greater impact than under either of these other legal systems that I talked about, the international system or the tribunal. That's not across the board, but I would say generally speaking, constitutional law, it's much harder to get the remedy, but once you do, you can have really significant change. So for example, one significant victory was around same-sex marriage, for example, that went through the courts as a constitutional case and resulted in the government being forced to legalize same-sex marriage. Significant victory.
Thank you, Kasari. We've got about 4 questions lined up, and some of them I see will be covered off in the second part of the presentation. So we've got a question from Richard, which I will ask later on because it's asking about a systemic issue. And we have a question from Dominique and then one from Paul. So we will get to those questions, but I wanted to ask this question, which was sent in by someone who was unable to attend today. And it's around service animals and strata and rental buildings. And it says, what is BC Human Rights Commissioner current thinking on challenges to the no pets provisions in strata and rental buildings from people who rely on pets as therapeutic emotional support animals? What have the decisions been, and what is the current advice to people wishing to establish their right to seek exemption for their therapeutic or emotional support animals from no pets strata bylaws and rental restrictions?
I wish I had a better answer for that than I do. I don't have a lot of knowledge in this area. I don't know if anybody else on the panel not to put anybody on this spot, but there's a couple folks here, obviously, who know, practice human rights and also work in the disability area that might know more of the details here than me. And if not, it's something that we can try to look into and get back to you if you want to provide your contact information.
I can provide some information if now's a good time. It's Laura speaking.
That's
Thanks,
great, Laura. Go ahead.
You can't see me, but hopefully you can hear me. There have been lots of cases about service animals in a variety of different contexts, including strata and rental contexts. And what I can just briefly say is that a blanket no animal rule will likely be problematic from a human rights perspective. In fact, blanket rules are often problematic from a human rights perspective because they don't take account of people's unique needs and circumstances. The duty to accommodate is a very important human rights principle that applies, as the slide right now is showing, applies in the context of people's tenancies and in the context of their strata under the services area of the Human Rights Code. And so the duty to accommodate a person's disability when that disability requires them to have a service animal may require a strata or a landlord to make exception and accommodate their unique needs.
Thank you so much, Laura.
You're welcome.
And so, as I've mentioned, there is a number of questions, and we will get to them once we get through the second part of the presentation. So over to you, Kasari.
Thanks, Sharon. Hold on one sec here. So then turning a bit to the role of the BC Human Rights Commission. As Human Rights Commissioner, my office works to address inequality, discrimination, and injustice in BC by shifting laws, policies, practices, and cultures. And Marga, maybe we can go to the next slide here. Thank you. We do this work through education, research, inquiry, and monitoring. And our vision is a province in which everyone's human rights are realized and our responsibilities to one another are fulfilled. Next slide, please. So I'm in the role of what's called an independent officer of the legislature, which means I don't report to government or to a ministry or a minister, but instead I report directly to the legislature. So I'm tasked with monitoring and acting as a watchdog for human rights in the province. It also means that we are a nonpartisan office. So I was not hired by government. I was hired by an all-party legislative committee. I don't get my budget. Our office doesn't get our budget from a ministry or from government who's elected of the day. We get it from an all-party legislative committee. So there's some important distinctions there, and I think primarily important for the fact that we can be independent in our critique and our oversight. And it also means that I think we have some real possibility of some sustainability as an office, which has been a problem in BC in terms of having a Human Rights Commission and then the Human Rights Commission being canceled a couple of times over the history of human rights in BC. Next slide, please. So our office is part of a three-part system of human rights here in BC. There is the Human Rights Tribunal, the Human Rights Clinic, and the Human Rights Commission. So the tribunal exists to hear and decide complaints from individuals. Again, this is kind of almost like a court, but with some important differences. And I did see a question in the chat earlier about how if you can't afford to bring your case to the tribunal, what do you do? How do you get help with that? And the tribunal is designed to be more accessible than a court is. It's one of the goals of the tribunal. I saw that there was another question about how can we make it more accessible, so we can talk about that later. But one of the places a key place that you can go to get assistance if you can't afford a lawyer is to the Human Rights Clinic, which is a service that exists to assist individuals to bring complaints before the tribunal. And Laura Track, who you've already heard from a couple of times, is here as both the Director of Education and staff lawyer at the clinic, and she will be able to speak after I've done these few comments to tell us more about the role of the clinic, which I'm hoping will answer that question more completely. So thank you again, Laura, for being here. While the BC Human Rights Tribunal has continuously adjudicated individual complaints, and the clinic has been around to assist with people bringing those complaints, what's been missing from that system for the last 17 or so years has been the means to address systemic concerns. So what does that mean? Systemic concerns mean human rights issues that don't just impact one individual, but really are about bigger systems like public policies, institutional practices, or cultural norms that act to perpetuate human rights. And that's where my job comes in. Next slide, please. Oh, I am going to pause right here and pass it over to Laura to tell us a bit more about the clinic. Thanks.
Okay. I assume it's intentional that I don't have video, and that's totally fine. If you're waiting for me to turn on my video, I actually cannot.
Okay.
Because the host has, I'm not sure, clicked a button or something, but that's totally fine. As long as you can hear me, that's really what matters. Although I did comb my hair before joining you all this afternoon.
We'll try and sort it out, Laura, see if we can fix that.
Okay, no problem. So the Human Rights Clinic, as both Sharon and Kasari have noted, is part of the Community Legal Assistance Society, or CLASS for short. CLASS has been around since 1971, and we've been providing free legal services to low-income folks ever since that time. The Human Rights Clinic assists specifically with human rights complaints made under the BC Human Rights Code, so not charter challenges, not international human rights issues. There we go, hi. But specifically with complaints that people have made to the BC Human Rights Tribunal. We are located in downtown Vancouver, but our services are province-wide, so we will do our very best to assist people no matter where in the province they are. Like many of you, we have been exploring new technologies over the last couple of months, and so we are doing meetings with clients over the phone, by Zoom, and making it work no matter where people are. So we provide a range of different services to people who've made complaints or who are thinking of making complaints and looking for more information about their rights and their options. First, we have an information line. Folks can call any day of the work week, Monday to Friday, 9 to 4:30, I believe, to get more information about human rights, about how to file a complaint, where to go to get the form, and just sort of basic general information about human rights. That's staffed by a real live person. It's not a recording. You'll be able to talk to someone and get pointed in the right direction. And the right direction may mean making an appointment with our Monday short service clinic. We used to call it a drop-in clinic, but we're trying to move away from that language because we hope that people will make appointments rather than drop in. And especially while we're offering these services online, it's helpful that people can make an appointment. But we do have these appointments available to anyone, again, anywhere in the province, whether you filed a complaint or not. Doesn't matter what your income is, doesn't matter what stage of the process you're at. You can make an appointment for a half an hour session with a lawyer or an advocate. We run these every Mondays, and we'll talk to you about your issue, your complaint, and give you some general advice and information to help you figure out what to do next. The next service that we offer is legal advice and representation. So the other two services are available to anyone at any point. To apply for legal advice and representation, you do have to have filed your human rights complaint already and had that complaint accepted for filing by the tribunal. So when you file your complaint, which is totally free to do, the tribunal will take some time to screen it and make sure that it's something that they can deal with. And provided that it is, they'll send you a letter saying, okay, your complaint has been accepted for filing. Now the rest of the process will get underway. And at that point, you can send that to us at the Human Rights Clinic and apply for legal representation. And it's at this stage that we do have to do a bit of screening because we simply don't have the staff or the resources to provide a lawyer or an advocate to everyone that applies, but we'll look at your income and look at our capacity to assist and do our very best to match you up with a lawyer or an advocate that can help. In particular, we try to help people who need some assistance at mediations. That's generally the first step in a human rights complaint, is that the parties will see if they can resolve the complaint through mediation, and we'll try to provide some assistance for that. If we can't provide full representation, at the very least, we can usually provide you with some coaching and some consultations to help support you to represent yourself and just feel like you have a better understanding of the process and what you need to do. And the last service that we offer, a little bit different than representation and advice, but we offer education. So I speak to community groups all over the province all the time to help them understand what the code applies to, how it works, what discrimination means, and how to access and make meaningful those rights in your own life. We also do workshops and trainings for those who, I really like this language that the commissioner is using, have responsibilities and are duty bearers under the Human Rights Code. So employers, landlords, other service providers, we help them understand their obligations, their duties, their responsibilities under human rights law. So we do workshops and trainings, again, around the province, usually in person, although lately we're doing lots by Zoom online, to help people understand both their rights and their responsibilities under the code. So that's a little bit about the clinic. I don't think I've mentioned this yet. Our services are totally free. We're funded by the provincial government for the most part to provide free legal services, so nobody has to pay for any of the advice or representation that they receive through our clinic. That was an important thing to make sure that I mentioned. Thanks again to the Commission for having me today.
Oh, thanks for being here, Laura. Laura, on very short notice, agreed to be with us today, and so I'm really happy that she had the time to spend with us this afternoon. We have a break scheduled now, just to give you a few minutes to have a bio break and take a few minutes. So our break is only for 5 minutes, but we'll play a little video for you. That's a part of our from our office, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. And after the video, we will put the slide up with all of the organizations, so that those of you who are asking to see that again, you can see it there noted. And we will see you shortly.
My name is Teresa Pocock. I like cherry tomato, green olives, and eating salmon. I am 55 and I'm South activate. I'm an artist, author, and a poet. And I own Down syndrome, but I am capable. I don't know human rights.
you like nursing homes?
No. That's all CCAC said. I couldn't make my own decisions. The CCAC said I couldn't decide where I live, or who cares for me. That is wrong. It's my human right to decide.
And you didn't want to live in a nursing home, did you?
No, I don't. No, that's wrong. It's my decision where I live. I do not want to live in a religion that's not nice. Now I'm in the community. I'm from Vancouver, Gastown, and Habit Street. I love Bill James and Frankie and Teresa. The community is helping us. I love my human rights. Pretty amazing. Right, me. Queen Olives and Manny Sandwich. I am 55 and I'm South activate. I'm an artist, author, and a poet. And I own Down syndrome, but I am capable. I don't know human rights.
Do you like nursing homes?
No. That's all CCAC said. I couldn't make my own decisions. The CCAC said I couldn't decide where I live, or who cares for me. That is wrong. It's my human right to decide.
And you didn't want to live in a nursing home, did you?
No, I don't. No, that's wrong. It's my decision where I live. I do not want to live in a religion that's not nice. involving the community. I'm from Vancouver, Gastown, and Habit City. I love Bill James and Frankie and Teresa. The community is helping us. I love my human rights. Pretty amazing. Like me.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. That was a video that we made with Teresa Pocock, and it's a part of our storytelling series, which will involve stories from across British Columbia that around bits of discrimination, but we want to bring you some of the positive stories that's coming out of human rights legislation. Over the next year or so, we'll be unfolding more we will be revealing more of those stories via a number of videos. So I'll just pass it over to Kasari to finish her presentation, and then we'll go to some of your questions.
Great, thank you. So turning then, you've heard about the other sort of aspects of the human rights system. So I'll delve a little bit more now into the role of the Human Rights Commission. And so our role is to provide access to justice on those issues that the individual complaint system has difficulty with, that it can't really address because they don't just involve the individuals that could appear before the tribunal. We're charged with examining the underlying causes of discrimination rather than the individual manifestations of it. So you have a slide in front of you, which is a quote that's really guided me in my thinking about this work. And that's from Robin DiAngelo, the author of the book White Fragility. And she says, racism is a structure, not an event. And there certainly are events of racism. There are individual instances of racism. And those are incredibly important for us to grapple with, and that's what the tribunal and the clinic and other clinical structures around the province exist to assist with. And what we're here to do is to work on the structures that uphold racism and to really address the kind of system, the ways in which racism, for example, or any of the other kind of intersectional forms of discrimination really are kind of baked into the system. So working through laws and policies, for example, that work to entrench these issues. So I want to tell a couple of stories to help us dig in a little bit to what we mean by systemic human rights issues. And it's a word that's had a lot more kind of mainstream engagement than it used to. We're going to go, I think, back a slide still. But I want to start with a story about an incident of racism. Of course, many of you will have heard about the rise of racism and violence or experienced the rise of racism and violence in BC over the last few years, especially during the pandemic. Locally, there was an incident of racism in the Seshat First Nation near Port Alberni during the beginning of June of this year. In the early hours of the morning, the driver of a white truck and his passengers came onto the reserve and proceeded to yell racial taunts and slurs at the residents. The truck drove slowly, circling multiple times, and many residents came out of their homes and started to video record the racist speech. That original video had been viewed on Facebook more than 14,000 times by the following afternoon. One of the band counselors, Hugh Breaker, was one of the many who witnessed the incident. And he said it reminded him of the 60s and 70s when he would experience frequent overt racism as a young person. He said, "I was hoping those days were all over, but apparently they're not. It all came rushing back." Port Alberni Mayor Sherry Minions joined Cynthia Dick, who was another elected, or was the chief counselor for the nation, in a joint video statement to stand together to condemn that issue of racism. And the mayor acknowledged that while it would be easier to write this off as a one-time experience, doing so would be unfair to those who had experienced racism firsthand so many times before. And of course, she's right. This example of hate and white supremacy is, of course, not an isolated incident. The most recent statistics on hate crimes across Canada show that there were nearly 1,800 incidents reported to police in 2018. 43% of those cases are motivated by race and ethnicity. And that's, of course, just those people who report to the police, which we know the numbers are in fact much higher. One community who was particularly experienced the rise of race-related racism, just racism during COVID-19 is the Asian community. So for this community, the Vancouver Police Department recently received 11 reports of anti-Asian hate-related crimes this past April alone. I have 11 in my notes, but I actually think that's 21 compared to at least half of that they'd experienced for the whole entire year in 2019. These statistics align with many of the stories we've heard of anti-Asian violence throughout the province. And these stories are the kinds that inspire sadness and anger and a feeling of overwhelm sometimes, and certainly raise many questions about the state of racism in our province. But I think they also are supported and allowed for by an entire system of cultural attitudes, practices, institutions, and laws. So I want to tell a different kind of story to illustrate that latter point. In June of 2019, after going through a C-section delivery in Kamloops, an Indigenous couple was elated to meet their first child, a baby girl. But less than 90 minutes after becoming parents for the first time, social workers came into the hospital to take the baby, saying they'd had a report of neglect. At the time, the maternal grandmother was there and she was able to hold off the apprehension for the time being, but 2 days later, social workers returned. The mother was asleep from a sedative that the medical staff had given her, and when she awoke, her newborn was gone. For months after this apprehension, the family wrestled to have their child returned to them. At one point, 2 social workers began to work with the family to support them. And ultimately, in September of last year, the province of BC ended the controversial birth alert system that resulted in that kind of intervention of removal of infants from their parents in the hospital. But that policy change doesn't, of course, turn back the clock for all those families and children who were impacted by this policy before that change. And of course, it has not changed, well, I shouldn't say of course, it has not changed the fate of baby H, the baby who was, I was just speaking about a moment ago, who remains in the child welfare system to this day while her parents fight to have her returned. And I think this story illustrates an important and sometimes overshadowed part of racism here in Canada, because it's not always the overt actions, it's not always the spray painted slur or the act of individual violence. sometimes even when individuals within the system are trying to help or support, like the social workers in that case, the laws and structures themselves in our society are consistently producing discriminatory outcomes for Indigenous and racialized people. In BC, Indigenous children are still 15 times more likely to be apprehended into child welfare than non-Indigenous children, 15 times more likely. So to combat this kind of structural and systemic human rights abuses, compassion and empathy are important starting points, but they're not enough. They don't get us all the way. Combating all of these issues, the racism, the misogyny, the ableism, and so on, are really require that kind of structural approach. So in BC, the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner has been created in order to tackle these kinds of issues and to really get at the underlying causes in a preventative manner, as opposed to addressing once they happen. Again, incredibly important that they're addressed once they happen, but they're not going to stop happening unless we can start to get at the roots of the problem. So to return to where we started today, we are here together, of course, in the midst of a global pandemic. And as I said earlier, in my view, there's no more important time to defend human rights than in times of crisis. But I think this moment of disruption offers not only these incredibly distressing and deeply disturbing stories about human rights violations, but it also gives rise to the opportunity to make change with this kind of really explosion in the world as we knew it. Huge changes have happened in very short order. Solutions that we previously thought likely impossible are actually being implemented. And I think we're in a moment to really think big. So there's a lot of work to do as the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. It's a very interesting moment to be forming our office, but I'm also very excited about the kind of opportunities that lie ahead. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you. I know there's been a number of questions, but I hope also there are comments. Of course, there's some comments embedded in those questions. So we want to hear from you what your priorities are. And before we get to that discussion, we're going to turn to the strategic priorities, and really we want to seek your feedback in doing that. And I think, Sharon, you're going to spend some time reviewing what those are. These are the priorities of our office as we've identified them. So thanks again for being here, and I look forward to your thoughts.
Okay, so this is the final part of our presentation, and we really want to just share with you how our thinking is evolving and where we see the office moving. And these are not the only things we will be tackling, but these are things we are putting our minds to as well. So of course, our ongoing priority is around discrimination as prohibited under the code. We will spend a lot of time speaking about what we call everyday discrimination. So those are the protected grounds we spoke about earlier in those 4 protected areas in employment and housing and publications and services. And so a lot of our work will always focus on the discrimination under the code. In addition to those, we will be spending some of our strategic focus on decolonization, because we know that in BC, that despite the number of complaints that we get from many other groups, that Indigenous people who experience a lot of discrimination don't use the complaint system. And so we want to know why, and we want to make sure that we are able to understand the situation for Indigenous peoples so that we can respond in under a human rights lens. We're also looking at issues around poverty and social condition. And we'd be curious to hear what you think about poverty as a human rights protected ground. And we saw that in the poll that you took, that you all felt that it was already covered. So I think that gives us a little bit of feedback already. Of course, we had taken, before this COVID moment, we had begun to think about hate and the rise of white supremacy in BC as a key issue that we wanted to address and that we would target some action against. And then in addition to that, we thought that we wanted to look at human rights of those who are detained by the state, either in detention or through or under the Mental Health Act. And so those are we say that there are 5 priorities. I mean, we have a number of priorities, but these are the ones we've targeted as important. And we would really love to hear from you about what you think about these and how you see, if you have any ideas about the work that we could do in each of those areas. So with that, I noticed that folks are continuing to raise their hands, and I'm just wondering if you could put your questions into the Q&A. And if it's not, then we will ask you to respond via the chat. So I will ask Emily to talk to those folks who've raised their hands in the chat, and I'll go right now to the questions that that have been queued up. We've had a question right from the start about systemic human rights issues and when and how we could do those kinds of investigations from the office. So I wonder if you wanted to comment on that, Kasari.
Sure. Yeah, so we have a number of tools available to us to make change on this systemic front that I've been describing. And among them are education. So this, being able to virtually travel across the province and engage in these kind of mutual education sessions where we learn a lot and hopefully we're able to share as well. And we're working on broad public awareness campaigns and a number of other mechanisms to try to move forward on our mandate. But as one of you has so rightly pointed out, there is a systemic investigation function as well. And so that part of the Act was delayed. It wasn't brought into force at the same time as the rest of the Act, which meant that we couldn't do that yet. So it was sitting there, it was passed by the legislature, but hadn't been brought into force. Our understanding is that that will be brought into force as of the beginning of September. So we are waiting for that to happen and are actively working on doing the research necessary to figure out what will be our first topic that we will tackle and how we will do that. Because as I think we'll get into more in a minute, lots of people, of course, in the chat have pointed out some of the procedural obstacles to being able to get justice on any of these issues. And we don't want our inquiry process to replicate those same procedural obstacles. So doing a lot of work in thinking through how do we make this process work for Indigenous people, how do we make it work for people with different abilities and needs, and just like a broad range of accessibility in its many, many forms. And not just a sort of an additive approach, but how do we build this thing to look quite different than a legal proceeding? So thinking through many of those aspects of starting an inquiry, and some of the issues, they're all fall within the strategic priorities here. So we're looking at issues around mental health detention, around racism, the rise of white supremacy, racism within certain contexts like schools and healthcare potentially. So there's a huge range of issues still on our list that we're whittling down to try to prioritize to tackle one by one.
Okay, Paul has asked a number of questions around the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I just wanted to bring the first question forward. It says that last year, Bill C-81 brought the CPRD into Canadian law. They also brought the right to housing into law. BC is planning disabilities rights legislation and consultations specifically, and its consultations specifically excluded CRPD Article 28, which is, I believe, adequate standard of living and social protection in its consultations. So, and so he's making a statement that that those rights won't be addressed in the BC legislation. Kasari, did you want to make a few comments about that?
Sure. I think your comment, Paul, really points to one of the difficulties in having all these different legal systems interacting, because they don't all sit well with each other. And of course, the legal systems that I didn't talk about in that overview were Indigenous laws and how those factor in as well. And of course, we know that not all these systems all aim to the same end all the time. So one example of that is that in international law, there are a number of rights around poverty, economic and social rights, like a right to housing, a right to food, a right to an adequate standard of living. None of those rights are built into our human rights structure here in BC and in Canada. So we, I think I often talk to people who their first example of human rights, what they feel most connected to in the context of human rights, are exactly those rights, are food and housing and shelter, all those pieces. And in fact, there are no rights protections in law in Canada that are enforceable in Canada around those issues. And so as Canada has been moving forward, and I think there has been some important progress on adopting some of the international law frameworks, for example, the Convention on People with Disabilities and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, two pieces that have recently made their way into Canadian law in important ways. Where they're going to struggle with implementation are on those rights, using a human rights framework for poverty. In fact, even our poverty reduction plan in BC doesn't use a human rights framework. And we've identified that as, there's obviously a lot more detail to this list of priorities, but one of the details under poverty is to really try to push the envelope on poverty as a human rights issue. That, I think that we have fundamental rights to those issues, to an adequate standard of living, for example, to not live in poverty, and pushing for those to be adopted in various ways in Canadian law. One of them is to prohibit discrimination on the basis of poverty, which is not right now built into the Human Rights Code and is something that we are actively working on.
Sorry, can you mention how we're able to influence the government, because we are an independent office, and so what is it that we can do when it comes to influencing the government on issues that we think are important?
Thanks, Sharon, because I think that's an important clarification. There's a lot of strength and power in being an independent office, and I sort of talked about it from that perspective. One of the disadvantages in some ways is that we are outside of government. We're a public institution, but we're not part of government. So what we do to influence, we have some avenues to access power of government, but what that means is just that we have some ability to have those background conversations. We don't make the laws ourselves. We don't have an ability to force them to change laws and policies. We just have some influence built into the system to be able to do that. So one of the ways that we can influence the system, as I said, is building in, sort of having conversations with ministers and pushing for change that way. And I've been doing a lot of that, especially over COVID, on some of the COVID related human rights issues. Another way is a bit more publicly. So we have the ability to present reports directly to the legislature. Many people may have followed the ombudsperson and the representative for children and youth, who are also independent officers of the legislature. Both also have that same function. So those are sometimes quite high profile. The representative for children and youth has made some really important reports that have gone to the legislature and really raised public awareness. And while they can't force government to act, they've had some really important progress along those lines. So the ombudsperson did a big report on social assistance a few years ago and got most of those recommendations accepted by government. So we're hoping that will give us some more teeth to move these issues forward.
We've got a couple of comments on the Human Rights Tribunal. One is around the fact that the process can be very long and difficult, and a question around accessibility. And I just wanted to let you know that the Human Rights Tribunal has undertaken a review of the way that its processes is working, and it's actually, at the moment, as we speak, undergoing an overhaul of the way that its forms work and the way that you can access information about the complaints process, all in an effort to make it more accessible and also to develop a process that would be more suitable for Indigenous people. So if you have comments that you might want to make to the tribunal, I would encourage you to contact the tribunal right now and let them know if there are ways that you think that they could improve their process, because they are, as I mentioned, undergoing a revisioning at the moment. And then another question came up around the tribunal, and that was about whether the commission, our commission, has oversight or can look at themes that the tribunal, the cases that the tribunal is hearing right now. So maybe Cassandra, you can speak to that.
Yes, I for sure can. And I see as well that someone's asked, why aren't we prioritizing the rights of people with disabilities? And in fact, absolutely, we are prioritizing the rights of people with disabilities. You will notice in our strategic priorities, we haven't done this by population of people, we've done it by issue. So of course, there are people with disabilities who are grappling with poverty, are grappling with discrimination under the code, are grappling with issues around discrimination and hate. So I think one of the reasons that we did that is because we recognize the ways in which our identities are interwoven. That it's quite hard to separate that rights of people with disabilities are over here, rights of women are over here, and rights of Indigenous people are over here. That in fact, lots of people share. We all have, not just lots of us, all of us have many, many aspects to our identity. We don't wake up one day in one box and not the other. So that was part of the reason to try to separate by issue as opposed to separating by identity. Here, I just lost the thread of your question, Jared. I went on a tangent and lost.
It's about whether we can look at human rights tribunal cases and look at common themes to see who, what kinds of complaints are coming up.
So that's what led me on that tangent, because one of the ways in which we are prioritizing people with disabilities is that the first priority area we've identified here, discrimination as prohibited under the code. One of the key ways that we want to identify the issues here, we're not looking at discrimination as prohibited by the code in individual circumstances, as much as looking to what's happening before the tribunal and identifying the kinds of themes that emerge there. So we know that the single largest group of folks bringing complaints are bringing complaints on the basis of disability. We know that the single largest area of discrimination is in the area of employment. So we can see some patterns there that we know, look, we need to do some preventative work. We need to do some education work with employers, for example, particularly around the issues of disability. That's of course not the only one, but just using that as an example to say, this is helping us identify where to put our efforts, particularly on the education front, I think, and developing some of the materials that we are developing to really target that. That process is still ongoing as we've developed a way to share information between the tribunal and the commission in order to build our work. One of the challenges and opportunities of being in this mode at this time is that we are both trying to start and build an organization, which takes a sustainable organization that's based on human rights principles, as well as actually do the work at the same time. So some of these things are kind of happening in tandem. So we're identifying the trends as well as building the systems to be able to identify those trends. One of the other pieces here is to identify the trends that aren't showing up before the tribunal. So we need to look at the tribunal to understand what cases are going through, what people are complaining about, but also to identify, look, these are what the statistics are showing us about human rights in the province, but they're not showing up in the tribunal, and what does that mean? So for example, we know Indigenous people face significant discrimination and systemic inequality in the province, but very few Indigenous people actually file complaints at the tribunal. So that also gives us some information to work on around accessibility of the process.
There's a question that came in around systemic racism with regard to law enforcement and justice systems. and whether the office is going to be taking any of that on. And that's one of our strategic priorities, to look at involuntary incarceration. So the answer to that question is yes, it's something we will definitely be looking at. And then we have quite a number of questions that I think can be answered as we move into our next section,
Sharon,
which is...
add one thing to that question around...
Sure.
So one of our big projects this summer is to delve into what needs to happen around the collection of race-based data and other disaggregated data about race and indigeneity, but also on a number of other grounds. And so we were tasked or asked by the Premier to provide some advice to the province about how to do that. And policing in the justice system is very high on that list. I mean, I think it's clear that COVID has sparked this conversation for those who have followed the conversation in the media and in community. There are many people calling for the collection of race-based data around the spread of the pandemic. Who's getting it? Who's being impacted? Who's dying? And how do we use that data to build better health outcomes? But that's just the means by which it's being called to attention right now. It's been a long time conversation around policing. And we very much intend to look at policing and the justice system in making our recommendations about what change needs to happen. So I just wanted to provide a concrete example of how we're looking at racism in the context of justice and policing. Thanks, Sharon.
No problem. So we've got somebody on the phone who's got a question, and I'm just going to say your last 4 digits, 2679. You've got a question?
Yes, my name is Graham McCreath, and I have a question. I'm a blind person, a member of the Canadian Federation of the Blind, and I've been a long time user of a guide dog, and I have to say that I hope the Tribunal is looked at by the Commission, and I hope so, and I'm really impressed with what's been said today. But my experience has been, and many others have too, that as soon as a guide dog is involved in an issue, the Tribunal really is has been very bad towards us as regard to, as far as I'm concerned, it's discrimination from them, because the law is there. 1974, the law came in for the rights, access rights of blind people in BC, and it was amended to include guide dogs, and it means that nobody is to be judged by their dog or anything else. It's us that refused access, and cases have been turned down and rejected and all kinds of things when there's a dog involved, and it's very bad for blind people because it puts them off ever wanting to appeal, and it's a form of oppression basically, and the Tribunal is responsible for this. And unfortunately, I've had questions saying to me from Tribunal members, oh, you weren't inconvenienced very much. So are they judging discrimination based on how much you're inconvenienced? So if the restaurant's a long way away, you're going to be inconvenienced very much, so that's okay. But if it's just next door, it doesn't matter. If I was an Indigenous person or somebody else, I find blind people are treated very badly, even by the Tribunal, when there's a dog involved. I did have a case when a dog wasn't involved, and it was better. So I just wonder what the Commissioner thought about that, and I hope things are reviewed and changed. I have a case going on right now. I don't really want to go to a public hearing because I'm afraid of what happened to my previous one. And I was turned down. There's never been any evidence that people have allergies, all this stuff. They've never proved it. So what the Commission would comment, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. I just wanted to note that this is an issue that we've heard a lot about from many disability advocates. We've heard about, for instance, I think the case you're speaking about is one where taxis won't pick up people with guide dogs, and it's difficult to understand why that might happen. And so I appreciate your calling in and letting us know of your experience with the Tribunal. And as I mentioned, they're going through a revisioning process, and we'll be sure to bring them this kind of feedback So thank you. Okay, while we have some questions still in the queue, we had some additional questions that we wanted to talk to you about. We see that disability is a key issue for you in this region, and we wanted to know, we wanted to ask you some other questions that might help bring out what the key issues are around human rights in the region, and to see if there are other issues that you're seeing raising up in your region. And so we had a question from Kathy, who is with the Victoria Disability Resource Center. And she will ask that question of you, to hear from you what you think is occurring in your region right now.
Question is, as public serving organizations, you receive questions for help about different human rights issues facing people in the Vancouver Island coastal community. What are the kinds of issues that you are hearing about? And also, what do you think are the most important human rights issues in the Vancouver Island and coastal communities?
So we'd love to hear from you about what you think are the key issues in your region.
So are you opening this up to the panel, or?
Yes, please, anybody.
Okay. So I think, sorry to jump in, Ron Rice from the Victorinator Friendship Center. There are a number of things going on right now in the region, in the province, in the country, in the world. Certainly top of mind, in following along with the conversation of policing. Chantal Moore, a New Channels woman on the East Coast, shot and killed by a police officer because allegedly she was holding a knife. I'm assuming that this police officer had a lot of training. I don't know if you've met many New Channels women, but they're very small people. So I'm confused by that in dramatic contrast to a military man driving his truck through an armed gate and carrying an illegal weapon and being in possession of other illegal weapons, and yet he gets a 2-hour de-escalation negotiation. So I think that's something that's on top of mind right now that is challenging to me as an Indigenous man. When you're so far away, I've met family members of this woman who came and said, we don't know what to do. I don't know what kind of advice to give them. And then the other thing that's on top of mind is the problems that have come to light around the healthcare system and the racism that our people face in emergency rooms. And I think a lot of people have probably read now by the news about the Saanich Peninsula Hospital playing a Price is Right game when it comes to guessing the blood alcohol content of Indigenous patients in their ER as a standard game that they played often. So I'm wondering, I guess that's sort of some of the things that are coming up for us right now around the healthcare system and policing.
Thank you for that, Ron. Kazar, do you have anything to say?
Incredibly important issues. Thanks so much, Ron, for raising them. Clearly significant issues that are very much on our minds. I watched Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, who is doing the investigation into the racism in healthcare. She presented on some of the parameters of the research that she's doing she presented on it today just before this, actually. And so I was watching to see, as we gain our investigative function, to make sure that what we do complements the work that she and her team are planning to do. So looking to see how complete the parameters of that work are, because I think they're still figuring some of that out. So if there is more that will be left uninvestigated on that front, I think it's share your deep concern about what's happening there, and not just in that one hospital, of course, but that being the tip of the iceberg for the racism that Indigenous people face in the healthcare system. So thank you for raising it.
So one of the participants has said that MOE, MCFD, MOH, access to services, ongoing issues for special needs children. Absolutely. So thank you, Katerina, for mentioning that. There's a question about whether the Commission ever plays a role in reporting back to government on areas where laws are problematic or contributing to structural discrimination.
Yes, absolutely. There is that role. It's up to us and how to do that. And as I say, there's a number of means that we can do that, including sort of less formal meetings with ministers and deputy ministers and folks working within government to try to influence the development of policy and bring what we're hearing from people to those conversations as they're happening, as laws and policies are getting developed, but also through more formal means, because what we're hearing from you and from folks as we virtually travel across the province, and our plan is to come back to each region on a regular basis to hear more about what's happening, and certainly to develop relationships excuse me, with many of you outside of the confines of this as well, because we need to hear from the concerns about what's happening around systemic inequality in general, not just racism, but systemic discrimination, so that we can inform those conversations. Those conversations simply can't happen. Our conversations with government can't happen in isolation from what we're hearing in community.
Certainly a lot of comments about disability. And that's clearly a priority in this region.
And I notice, I'm sorry, I'm not able to read in detail all the questions as I was speaking, but I do notice a key word around education and children with disabilities coming up there. So I want to acknowledge that there are some really significant issues in this region that are being flagged here. And that's something that we are trying to learn more about and how that fits in. I will give the example of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which is doing right to read inquiry across that province. So certainly as we try to figure out what our inquiries are going forward over the next number of years, we have a really good example of how that's being rolled out, how reading is being taught or not taught in schools in that province, particularly for children with learning disabilities. So I'm appreciating the comments so that we can learn more and make our decisions based again on what we're hearing here. Thank you for that.
Okay. And I'm just looking at the people with their hands up. I see that Dominique has her hand up. So Dominique, if you want to unmute yourself, you'll be able to ask your question.
Yes, I just actually had a comment about the struggles that racialized women face in the healthcare system. This has been an ongoing issue for many, many years, and it affects so many women of color, and specifically Black and Indigenous women, are not getting the medical treatment that they're seeking. They're either being misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all, coming up against racist specialists, doctors' offices. I work for an organization called the Support Network for Indigenous Women and Women of Color. And the problem with racialized women going into these appointments was so pervasive that we've even started a peer support program to have another woman paired with the patient going into the appointments together, because we're just being inundated with issues in the healthcare system, specifically Black women, specifically Indigenous women. So I'm wondering what could be a way forward for women who are facing issues in healthcare. How can we get these issues addressed by the Human Rights Tribunal? How can we large database of a complaint system so that we know that other people are also dealing with the same issues and join our complaints together and make a stronger case to move forward.
Thank you, Dominique, for raising those important issues. And I think, I mean, I won't be able to provide you with a very satisfactory answer, but I'll do my best to chip away at it. The reason I can't provide you with a really satisfactory answer is how to address some of these big systemic issues. There isn't a perfect answer to that. We're taking forward various systemic issues in various ways. We're not able as a commission to file our own complaints before the tribunal, but we are able to support systemic complaints as they go forward in a couple of different ways, including intervening in cases as they go forward, which means that we don't represent either side, but we become involved as a third party to say, here are some of the bigger or systemic issues at play here, that this issue doesn't just affect the parties involved, but is larger than that. And I think what you're pointing to, Dominique, is what we've been hearing a lot about from a number of different communities actually is what people are calling microaggression. So the sort of cumulative effect of a number of mistreatments that add up to really significant racism often, but they're hard to challenge in their individual capacity. That may be some of what you're getting at, and thinking through whether there are mechanisms to address that through the tribunal or not. And I think in some limited cases, there are some mechanisms to address through the tribunal, but some of what community organizing is happening is really interesting. So there's a project called Project 1907 that's collecting individual stories of racism that Asian Canadians have been facing during COVID in BC. And so collecting that information in a database and using that to raise awareness. There's another project that's just getting off the ground around Indigenous people experiencing microaggressions in a variety of settings, again, collecting that information to raise awareness and make change. So those are a couple of interesting innovations that are happening right now and being developed. Laura, I don't know if you had any other thoughts about litigating those issues before the tribunal. You're able to weigh in.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure, sorry, sorry to bring you in like that. I was just, Dominique was talking about the racism, the face or racism and misogyny maybe that racialized women are facing within the healthcare system, and some of the impacts on their health that flow from that, and how to get action on that systemic issue. She was particularly asking about the tribunal. I was sort of giving a bit of a broader context, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about litigating those issues before the tribunal, because of course that's what you do.
Sure, yeah. Gosh, so much I could say, and I'm mindful of the time and the fact there may be other questions. I guess I want to say two things. First of all, my heart broke when I read the story that Ron was referring to earlier about the Price is Right game that hospital workers were playing with respect to Indigenous folks that they were there to care for and provide medical services to. It was absolutely horrifying to hear that. And I know that those are not isolated stories and that is not a new problem, but reading those stories was just a real shock. And as a human rights lawyer, those are things that we want to believe are not happening in our communities, but it's a stark reminder that they are. And it's also a reminder for me that our human rights tribunal system has not been serving Indigenous communities well, because stories like that very rarely make their way to the Human Rights Tribunal. And Sharon has mentioned that the tribunal is working on addressing the underrepresentation of Indigenous people before the tribunal. And our human rights clinic recognizes that we're implicated in that those shortcomings too. If folks are not making complaints to the Human Rights Tribunal, part of the problem is that they don't know that there's free, accessible service available to them, or even if they do know, perhaps they don't trust it. So we know that we have work to do as well to ensure that Indigenous people are feeling safe to access the human rights system and access our services. The other thing I just want to note is that the Human Rights Tribunal and the rights that we've been talking about, they're individual rights. And most complaints are brought by individuals. And that is in some sense a shortcoming of the human rights system, but also important to know that individuals can and do bring systemic cases forward. And just because it's one person bringing a case forward doesn't mean that the tribunal may not be able to award a systemic remedy. One person really can make a difference in those kinds of cases. I acknowledge it's a big undertaking, and folks have pointed out the time and difficulties that exist to pursuing a human rights complaint all the way through to a hearing, but the ultimate result can be big systemic change. And just a few months ago, an Indigenous woman named Deborah Campbell won a case against the VPD. She was just one woman who brought that case forward with excellent legal counsel, not me, helping her. But she was able to get systemic remedies, including an order that the VPD undertake training to deal and address systemic racism within the policing system here in Vancouver. So there are opportunities to have the tribunal address big systemic issues like discrimination in our institutions, including policing, including the healthcare system, through litigation. But of course, I do acknowledge, as others have already, that it's a big undertaking, and we're there to try to help as best we can.
Thanks so much. I just sent Laura a quick note saying, sorry, Laura, we're going over time, and she wrapped it up right then. So I'd like to thank Laura for being with us today on very short notice, and for sharing with us the work that you're doing and the work that the clinic's doing. I'd like to thank our co-hosts, Ron Rice from the Victoria Friendship Center, as well as Kathy Elford from the Victoria Disability Resources Center. Thank you so much for spending the time with us and sharing what you have over the past week about your organizations and the work that you're doing. And I'd also like to thank Elder Alex Nelson, who opened us so beautifully. We have a quick poll to do, and I would invite Alex if he'd like to say a few closing words if he wants to, but only if he wants to. But before that, I'll ask Kasari to say any final words that she might want to say, and then we'll have Alex, and then we'll leave the poll up for those of you who want to stay.
I just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us. And even if we didn't have a chance to address your comment or your thought that you expressed in the chat or in the Q&A, we are taking all this back with us to our office and sharing it with the team so that you know that it's being integrated into our plan. So thank you again, and I hope you're able to join us in the future.
And Alex.
Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Okay. Once again, I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful and powerful word, spirit, and direction. And I just like to quickly allude to teachings that we have with our ancestors. We have what we call a sisiuth, and it's a double-headed figure with a person in the middle. And we are the people in the middle trying to search for what's right and what's good and what's bad and what's wrong. And we try to sort it out, and we're always in pursuit of the good and right. And I see this process is leading in that direction. And I just want to acknowledge the strength of all the people that came on board to be with us as we gather each other, and we give each other strength. And the numbers that are here right now is going to add. So with that, thank you for your great hearts, and take care and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.